Okay, welcome everyone. We've got a good group gathered here, so we're going to go ahead and get started.
Okay.
If you can please remember to mute when you're not speaking. Hello again. Hi everyone. My name is Rachel Jacobson, she, her. I am Deputy Director at American Society of Adaptation Professionals, and you are here on our second day of the ASAP Private Sector Climate Service Providers Academy. And today we are going to be talking about the principles of quality climate change adaptation. As
So
with all of our
so you
sessions,
can
today's session
change the
will run
order.
from 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. So welcome back and welcome to day 2. Here's what we're going to be doing together today. Like last week, after a brief introduction to the session, we're going to be going into small groups where you'll have a chance to meet other folks in the room and share a little bit about yourself and what you're hoping to get out of today's session. And then I'm going to give an overview of ASAP's professional guidance resources, and in particular, the Living Guide to the Principles of Climate Change Adaptation. And then we are so lucky to be hearing from 2 case study presenters today who will share case studies of adaptation excellence. We have Dr. Sue Kemble-Cook from WSP and Graham Nibbs from Stantec. After that, we'll take a break, we'll do a Q&A with our presenters, and then we'll really get into the meat of it through a peer learning discussion where you'll have an opportunity to assess your own climate adaptation practice through the lens of ASAP's Living Guide to the Principles of Climate Change Adaptation. And then, of course, we will provide some information at the very end about what to expect next week when we have not 1 but 2 sessions planned for you. And then we'll end right at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. So just a little view of our learning objectives for today's session. We want you to come away from this session being able to recognize principles for quality climate change adaptation in your work and in others' work. We want you to have a chance to prioritize which principles are most important to you and consider where you have the power to make improvements in your work or to influence others through the application of those principles. All right, and with that, I am going to turn it over to our training specialist, Mia Dozier, who will guide us into our first breakout activity.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be in community again with you all today. You might remember me from the opening session. My name is Mia Dozier. My pronouns are she, they, and I am ASAP's training specialist, residing on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And like Rachel said, I'll be guiding you through today's activity. So soon we're going to be headed into the small group where you all have a chance to introduce yourself to other participants, share your experience with climate data information, and discuss what you're hoping to learn today. And you can find these questions in your participant breakout slide deck available in your resource folder on the Academy website. And the direct link to that should be coming in right now in the chat. All right, so I'll hand it over to Megan, who's going to be putting you all in your breakout room.
All right, welcome back, everyone. So we're going to be moving into the presentation portion of our agenda here. And first, I'll be giving an overview of ASAP's professional guidance resources, and specifically the Living Guide to the Principles of Climate Change Adaptation. So ASAP has 5 professional guidance resources. We have our Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Statement, our Code of Conduct and Professional Ethics, our Living Guide to the Principles of Climate Change Adaptation, and our Knowledge and Competencies Framework. And today we're going to focus in on the Living Guide, but I encourage you to check out all of these resources after the training, and I think we'll have a link coming around in the chat where you can view all of them. All of these resources were created with, by, and for members, and this slide illustrates the goals of the processes that we use to create and update these resources. So we strive for cross-sector collaboration in defining and developing the content, democratic processes in sort of resolving kind of what content goes in, what definitions we use, and our network values at ASAP, which include cultures of trust and working together to address complex issues. And one key thing that these resources do is they bridge the language gap between the many actors in the climate adaptation and resilience space. So for example, we have banks and financial institutions that may be talking about risk and materiality. We have municipalities and public entities that may be focusing on words like vulnerability and resilience. Communities and community-based organizations focusing on human health, community assets, air and water quality. Then we have engineers and designers. A lot of folks are in the room today talking about designs and standards in addition to maybe some of those other words that I already mentioned. We've got ecosystem um, managers talking about restoration and conservation, and then businesses and corporations talking about things like assets and continuity. And all of those things are in Venn diagram with one another, and we try to make these resources resonate across the languages that are used in those various contexts to help different folks network, learn, and ultimately work together. So if there are particular phrases that come to mind for you when you think about preparing for and adapting to the impacts of climate change, we'd love for you to kind of put those in the chat. We can view them as we're going through the presentation right now. But I am going to move on as well. And I'm going to first briefly describe some key points from our Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion statement, our Code of Ethics, and our Knowledge and Competencies framework before diving into the Living Guide. So first, our Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, or JEDI statement, acknowledges injustice and the fact that climate change exacerbates injustice, and it commits us to removing oppressive systems, and perhaps most importantly, it describes a vision for transformation. And I'm going to pause here for a second and give folks a minute to read a little bit of what's on the slide, and if there's something in particular that's resonating with you, if you want to share that in the chat, please go ahead. All right. We can still share in the chat. I'm going to move on to our Code of Ethics. And one thing that's important to know about our Code of Ethics is that it begins by stating values and beliefs. And by beginning with values and beliefs, we are saying that knowledge alone is not enough for ethical action. Sometimes we need to take action even in the absence of information. And sometimes the information we have tells us that an action isn't cost effective or gives us some other reason for not taking that action, but we take that action anyway because of the values and beliefs that we hold. And I just want to, before we move on to the next resource, pause here. We have this really awesome quote from our partner Jim Fox at NEMAC Fernleaf. And Jim is actually going to be facilitating our session next Tuesday, our Midwest Regional session. And he shared about how he has been using the Code of Ethics to help articulate the values of his company to partners. And so I hope that this can be a bit of an inspiration for all of you as you're thinking about ways that you can apply these resources in your work. Okay, so focusing in on our knowledge and competencies framework, we use this framework to guide and assess our members and partners' adaptation and resilience education programs. And you can use it to assess either your own organization's workforce education or just your own knowledge and competencies and consider what types of educational opportunities to seek out. And the idea is that the framework provides a complete view of the knowledge and competencies needed to ensure that professionals, students, and learners of all types are prepared to effectively address adaptation and resilience in the context of their work. So this is a list of the foundational knowledge areas, and then this is a list of the core competencies. And again, the idea is that any adaptation resilience professional would possess each of these core competencies. And then there are sets of associated skills, abilities, and attitudes that vary depending on what sector, industry, job role you're working in. So this is kind of the foundation, and then building out from there, depending on what kind of work you're doing. And I just want to highlight one of the applications of our knowledge and competencies framework. So we've had a lot of focus in developing workforce education, in developing professional education for broader groups, as well as in higher education course development. And here's a quote from one of our partners, Lily Swambro Becker, who used it to develop the Adapting to a Changing Gulf Region course for ecosystem managers. Okay, and now this is kind of the main item on our agenda for this presentation, which is the Living Guide to the Principles of Climate Adaptation. And the Living Guide starts with desired outcomes. These are the why of climate adaptation. And the first why is to enhance adaptive capacity. which we can think about as making sure people have the tools they need to adapt to climate change. So, for example, some of those tools are knowledge, community connection, money, good governance. The other two Y's are to reduce exposure and reduce sensitivity. Exposure. This is how close you are to a climate hazard. And so to reduce exposure, we want to move things out of harm's way. For example, making sure housing is not built in an area that repeatedly floods. And then sensitivity. If you're affected by a climate hazard, how intense will that affect? And an example of reducing sensitivity is using fire-resistant materials in wildfire-prone areas. And then the next question is for whom? And first and foremost, we need to work to achieve these outcomes with and for those folks who are both highly exposed to climate risks because of where they live and work and have less capacity to respond because of widespread discrimination. And some of the groups of people that we think about first and foremost as being at the forefront of adaptation are Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, people with low income, immigrants and refugees, outdoor and migrant workers, and people with disabilities. But the most important point is that we have to incorporate these folks' lived experience into climate adaptation actions. And only by doing that will those actions be equitable and effective. Okay, so what do we need to do to adapt to climate change? The next section of the Living Guide talks about the what, or the categories of action. And here are some basic categories of how the work gets done. Things like planning, communicating, building, and hopefully you recognize your own work in one or more of these categories, and they're certainly not mutually exclusive. And then I think I've said the real meat like already 3 times today, but the real meat of the Living Guide and what we're going to focus on today is this set of 15 principles. And this will be the focus of the rest of our training. These principles articulate how we should do climate adaptation and climate resilience work to ensure that it is equitable and effective. And the first 3 principles we'll think about together are recognize context, think in systems, and address root causes of climate change, i.e. greenhouse gas emissions. These principles are helping us to see that both our challenges and opportunities are connected, and we need to think in an integrated and systems-focused way as we take action on climate change. Another set of 3 principles to think about together are safeguard people, safeguard nature, and avoid harm or avoid maladaptation. And these 3 principles are all connected by an ethic of care and the need to be really intentional in our work and recognize potential negative consequences. Next, these 2 principles use best available science and knowledge and use projections about future conditions are about being intentional about what inputs you use in deciding how to take action to adapt to climate change. And of course, these 2 principles are a huge focus of our course. And but there are also a lot of different ways to address them and to apply them, which hopefully we will have a chance to see throughout our time together. Science and knowledge. This includes Western science, lived experience, and traditional knowledges. And then future conditions that are important to consider aren't just climate conditions, also future demographic conditions, ecological conditions, and so on. Then these 3 principles, understand injustice and work towards justice, ensure fairness in decision-making, and ensure equitable distribution of costs and benefits, help us keep different aspects of justice and equity central to our climate adaptation work. Each of these works in its own unique way. These 3 principles, network and learn together, collaborate, and use existing best practices, are about being open to learning from and working with people across contexts and building on what's been established in other geographies, fields of practice, or industries. But of course, we want to always call back to that first set of principles, which included recognizing context, and not just recognizing context, but really deriving the work from the local place. We can do those things simultaneously. We can learn from other places and other contexts while also uniquely addressing the context of the work that's in front of us in the place that we're in. And then this final principle, take care, acknowledges that we need support to do the difficult work of adapting to climate change. And I want to take an extra moment here to offer a few ideas on how we can keep this principle in mind. So we can focus on assets, the positive things we have in our lives and in our communities. We can focus on where we have power to make change. And I hope that that will be a big focus of our, at least kind of towards the end of our time together today. We can take breaks for our bodies and our brains. We can be in community and seek and give mutual support. And we can seek joy, whether that's seeking joy in the work itself, in the world around us, in our hobbies, or in our families. And then the final section of the Living Guide shares strategies and approaches for gaining traction for adaptation action and maximizing its effectiveness. We're not focusing strongly on these today, but I do encourage you to take a look later, think about how you can use them in your work. All right, and then before we move on to our next section of the agenda, I just want to share this kind of final application slide. This is from our um, longtime member and board member, Emily Wasley, who leads resilience and biodiversity at Meta. She used the Living Guide to come up with her own core adaptation and resilience principles. And this is, in some ways, what you'll be doing a little bit later on. So we can all seek a little bit of inspiration from Emily and thinking about how can we synthesize these principles for ourselves so that we're able to keep them in mind in our daily work. Okay, so I'm going to pause there. That's a lot of information. There's a whole set of professional guidance resources. Then there's a whole 13-page living guide. And probably some of you had a chance to dive into the guide before you got here today, but I'm sure others have not yet had a chance to dive into it. So before we move on to our case studies, I just want to pause and see if there are any questions coming in from folks. It looks like we've had a really productive conversation about transformation and climate justice in the chat, as well as the systems that have caused climate change and continue to exacerbate it. So thank you so much, Alice and Josh. Any other questions that are coming up for folks? Yeah, Josh, that's a good question. Are we also thinking about principles of implementation? So yeah, the Living Guide talks a little bit about using best practices in project design and implementation. And then in the strategies and approaches, I would say is kind of where you get the closest to that. So yeah, just going back there, recognize and activate leadership, mainstream climate change information and adaptation action into what's already happening in a community, improve connection to improve resilience. We talk about flexibility, robustness, and redundancy. And then we get into a little bit of the policy incentives and then using windows of opportunity, such as after a disaster. And feel free to unmute if and let us know if this is along the lines of what you were wondering about in terms of principles of implementation. We've never identified these strategies and approaches as such, but that's what comes to mind for me.
No, that's good. I guess maybe what I'm thinking about is more like tactics than
Mm-hmm.
principles. Because it's also there's lots of discussion about principles, but then my first question when I see a list like this is how do I do each one? Is there
Mm-hmm.
a subset of principles that can be talked about, like what does it mean to mainstream? How would you mainstream? What are some examples of
Mm.
mainstreaming? And I guess we're going to talk about the case studies that'll help. So, but it just
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. That's a good question. The Living Guide itself does not go super in depth on that. It gives a little bit, it gives a short description of each of these strategies and approaches, and then it provides like a couple of examples of what that might look like. But that's a really great idea for building out the Living Guide. So thanks.
Thanks, Rachel. This is Alice. I'm wondering when we and thanks for bringing in the context of putting these into practice. I'm wondering if there is a way we can remind ourselves when we come to this and the good principles of safeguarding people, safeguarding nature. In isolation, um, it's great to understand those, but then in practice, when we're in the
Mm-hmm.
complexity of practice, I like to think of it as reminders of in context instead of profit. right?
Mm-hmm.
Instead of what is the cheapest thing or what is the most profitable thing. Choose
Mm-hmm.
people always over profit. That's what I would add.
Yeah, thank you so much for underscoring that, Alice. And I think that if folks, yeah, for folks who are interested in finding the way that we've articulated that through the professional guidance resources, I would actually recommend the Code of Ethics, which probably does the best job of speaking directly to some of the things that you were just sharing. Because it focuses a little bit more on beliefs, which again, values and beliefs, which can be like a tricky thing in a science-based field. But yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Eliza just put in the chat, again, the link where you can find all of the professional guidance resources, including the Living Guide and the Code of Ethics. And I just want to pick up on one other thing that you said, Alice, which is about complexity. And I think, we talk about this a little bit in the Living Guide, which is like, there are going to be tensions between these principles. There are going to be tensions, there are going to be pressures that make it really difficult to apply them. And sometimes there are going to be trade-offs between them. And so, it's really only through having these like active discussions, being able to work through case studies, both other people's and our own, that we can kind of exercise those muscles for working through those tensions, for figuring out how to make those trade-offs. So yeah, those are real. And some things we want, some things we can have convictions about, and then other things like, in many instances, it's not clear what to do. And so that's why we have each other and we have trainings like this to kind of get into it and build those muscles. All right. So with that, oh, Sue, I'm apologize that your photo is so blurry. We're gonna have the real Sue with a non-blurry video, so this will be great. I am so excited to welcome Dr. Sue Kemble-Cook as our first case study speaker. She is a vice president with WSP and leads the Sustainability, Energy, and Climate Change Group's climate risk practice. She's a climate scientist by training, and her early career was spent developing climate models and doing climate research. At WSP, Sue supports clients in evaluating and managing their climate risks and mainstreaming climate across their organizations. Her expertise includes climate risk and resilience assessment, analysis and enhancement of climate governance, and development of resilience and low carbon transition plans. Welcome, Sue.
Thanks so much, Rachel. I appreciate the introduction and also the opportunity to speak with you all today. I'm going to try to share my screen and walk you through a case study that hopefully illustrates some of the principles that Rachel was just describing. I had a hard time, figuring out which principles to discuss because so many of them are directly relevant to our work. All right, okay, great. So a little bit of context on WSP, which is the company I work for. So we're an engineering and professional services firm with teams around the world helping clients deal with climate change issues. Our clients in our sustainability, energy, and climate change team, that's where I sit. Our clients are mostly private sector, Fortune 500 companies, and typically they come to us because they are facing new regulation around climate disclosures, some of the EU regulation, for example, the new California laws around climate disclosure. Their investors are pressuring them to assess and disclose their risks. So these are the things that bring them to wanting to understand the impacts of climate change on their business, and of course, to get ready for the physical impacts of climate and adapt to them. Our clients span a broad range of sectors, and typically these are big multinational companies that have very large portfolios of assets and complex supply chains. So that's challenging because if a company is trying to figure out how to allocate resources for their resilience and adaptation planning, where should they focus them best? So typically what we do is we do a portfolio screening at a high level. So a hazard screening that looks at all the assets sort of high level with, relatively, for example, low resolution flooding modeling. And we figure out which ones are most exposed. And then we take that subset of highly exposed assets and we do resilience assessments for those to figure out, okay, has this site actually seen some impacts in the past? What are they doing to address those impacts? What sort of insurance do they have? So what's their adaptive capacity? What resilience measures are they already taking? And then for the ones that come up as low resilience, high exposure, for those we might really focus more detailed planning like high resolution flood modeling, really trying to do benefit cost analysis for different adaptation measures and really get down to the nitty gritty of adaptation planning that can sometimes be rather expensive. So this phased approach is designed to save effort and cost and target resources where they are most needed. So how do we figure out what kind of climate risks our clients' assets will face? Here's where we're guided by these ASAP principles of use the best available science and information. And so for our clients, there is a real value for them in using peer-reviewed science and using transparent methods, not just because it helps them explain to their investors what they've done, but also because with the new climate regulations, there's these companies are going to have these analyses audited in the future. So we really have to be clear about what we're doing and why. So to deal with the uncertainty of future climate change, we use a scenario analysis approach, which is aligned with the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So that again is guidance on best practices in this area of forward-looking climate assessment. So we typically will take a high emission scenario, like the one outlined here at the top, with more fossil fuel development, less regulation on carbon. And we'll also look at a lower emission scenario that's a more rapid transition to a low carbon economy. And the way we figure out what's going to happen at a particular place in the future is to use data from climate models. Climate models are computer simulations of the Earth's climate system that let us understand how the Earth might and its climate system may respond to different levels of greenhouse gas emissions in the future. And they let us look at a particular place and understand how temperature might change, how changes in heavy rainfall may occur depending on which climate scenario we're looking at. So like a weather forecast model, which is what they're essentially similar to, it can help you look out into the future. And that is the best available practice, best available data for this type of work. So what we do is we get data from these climate models, which are publicly available and peer reviewed, and we look at each of the client's asset locations, and we try to understand how these hazards may change over time. How will water stress change? How will rising sea levels affect the site? And we try to understand through impact pathways how it might affect the client's assets and operations, and then what are the knock-on financial impacts to their revenues, to business interruption, and so forth. So really trying to tie it back to impacts. So what I'm going to do now is show you an example from an assessment that we recently did. This is a very large company. It's got a portfolio of probably 700 assets or so. And so the idea was to figure out which ones were most important to target for resilience planning. So we did a high-level evaluation of the entire portfolio using screening level data, and this site popped up as one that we needed to take a further look at. So the site's located in an urban area in downtown San Francisco. It's about a 0.4 mile from San Francisco Bay. So this is the building. If you imagine that you're on the street right here and you're looking out toward the bay, this is the ferry building here, which sits right at the edge of the water. And so that's right there. So it's close to the bay, but not right on the water. And that's important because the San Francisco Bay, as you can see here, connects to the ocean. So this is a tidal area exposed to sea level rise. The climate here is generally temperate, doesn't snow mostly. It's a Mediterranean climate. And our client is a tenant in this building. Many of the staff who work there commute from all around the Bay Area and use public transportation. So that's kind of the regional overview of the site. So when we looked across the entire portfolio and we looked at modeled average annual loss, so a dollar amount of potential future losses for the 2030s for both the lower emission scenario shown in green and the higher emission scenario. So we looked across a range of hazards shown here at the bottom to figure out what the losses for that decade were associated with each of the with this facility that I just showed you. And so what popped up here are changes in temperature extremes, so heat waves, potential losses from that. So that could be things like more cooling costs, impacts on staff, some impact from wildfire, and then the biggest one was coastal flooding. So as we looked at this, we thought, okay, that seems a little high. The site's almost half a mile from the water. Let's check this out using more granular local data. And let's find out the lived experience of people at the office who work there and find out if they've seen sort of these impacts that we're seeing. So this is the resilience assessment component. It's actually talking to people who work at the site and understanding and telling them, this is what we see going out in the future. Tell us what you've seen in the past so that we can understand past impacts and costs and understand resilience and adaptation measures. And then typically what we do at this phase is to take the data we've got, take it together with information that we gather through questionnaires and interviews. And then we try to understand with more granular data what the risks are in a more sort of detailed sense. And this process allows us both to educate the people at the facility and also to co-develop resilience measures in a way that feels like they have ownership and they can guide it because they're the ones who know the site best. So I'm going to go very briefly through some of the more granular data that we leveraged for this site. Because it's in California, we were able to leverage the state's database of high-resolution climate projections from CalAdapt. So we confirmed that the site is expected to see, future changes in heat, more heat waves that probably will stress the power grid, leading to potential for more blackouts. Heating costs will probably go up. But again, this is office staff, so it's not people working outside. So they have minimal direct exposure. So probably heating costs are the main impact pathway there. The thing about higher heat is it makes it easier for smog to form. So this site's likely to see more spare the air days with a lot of ozone formation, like you see here on the left. And of course, if you've got more heat and more drought, you get more wildfires. And so this is looking toward the site on a day in 2020 when the site was seeing impacts from smoke from wildfire that was over 100 miles away. So these are not direct impacts from heat and flames, but impacts to air quality from distant fires. And the CalAdapt projections for wildfire probability definitely show sort of an increase in time of the probability of these kinds of wildfires that affect air quality. So you can see here the data for the recent past. The shading shows you the decadal probability of a wildfire throughout California. And you can see as you go out into the future, these darker ones, the darker coloring indicates potential for wildfire increasing.
2 minutes, Sue.
Thank you. So the other thing we looked at was that big bar that showed coastal flooding. So long story short, we looked at high resolution flood maps from our CoStar Future, which has this is the best available resource for this kind of hazard for this area. We looked at the present day 100-year storm, found no impacts. If we look at 1 meter of sea level rise, we see some flooding along the coast, but not near the building. It takes 1.5 meters of sea level rise in a 100-year storm to flood this, to bring water to the base of the building. So we think then that first estimate of flood risk was overrated. So using the more best available data, the more granular data, we find a more accurate assessment of the actual risk. And when we tried to understand when that risk was present, this 1.5 meters of sea level, it's not until the end of this century. So really just thinking that the direct risk is minimal. However, another important thing we do is we look at the community surrounding the asset. What's going on in terms of public planning? What are the public agencies doing? Now, a lot of work has been done on coastal planning in San Francisco and the Bay Area, and they've identified that by the 2030s, that level of sea level rise is likely to cause problems for the public transit network and for the area along the seawall. And so that would affect the employees commuting to work. However, there's a vigorous adaptation planning underway to reduce that risk. And so when we think about what we're recommending to this company, it's implement company-wide procedures for tracking financial impacts, so sort of mainstreaming these risks across the organization and developing systems for managing those risks. Plan for interconnected risks from heat, wildfire, and disruptions to the power grid. Engage with their landlord on facility control measures, and most especially the host community to engage with those adaptation planning efforts to direct their direction, to consider co-benefits of investing with them, and really to try to engage as much as possible to understand the risk and to reduce it. So finally, getting back to the principles. So what we've done here is shown that application of best available science and knowledge and using the future conditions, that's critical to this work. Engaging both with the people in the facility and with the company at large to sort of mainstream the findings and to develop processes for managing climate risks. And when we develop adaptation actions with the company, we're always thinking of things that are low emissions because they're always trying to reduce their carbon footprint at the same time. So renewable energy for backup power, especially solar panels, backup batteries, that kind of thing. And then just thinking about how to mainstream climate information and adaptation action throughout the company is critical in every engagement that we do. So I will stop there and pass it back to you, Rachel. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sue. And we are going to have a Q&A period with both Sue and our next speaker, and that will be after the break. So now we're going to move into our next case study presentation. We're so excited to welcome Graham Nibbs from Stantec. Graham has been engaged in geoscience research and consulting services for over 10 years in Canada. While his experience is global, he resides and primarily practices in British Columbia, Canada, where there is no shortage of natural hazards. Drawn to the areas of geomorphology and landslide hazards, Graham focuses his expertise on debris flow as a geohazard specialist with Stantec Consulting Limited. Believing in creating innovative and effective solutions for clients, Graham leverages his experience and aptitude for problem solving, modeling, GIS, and expertise regarding geohazards to deliver practical geohazard solutions to Stantec's global client base. Welcome, Graham.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rachel, sorry. And Sue, great presentation. That was fantastic. I'd just like to say I'm joined here today with Stantec's vice president, or one of our vice presidents and director of geohazards and geomorphology, Dr. Rick Guthrie, and also one of our senior principals down in the Fort Collins, Colorado office, Thad Waskowitz. So Stantec's a large global consulting company. We're about 50,000 large offices across the globe. I reside in British Columbia here and practice mainly out of Canada, but obviously my expertise expands across the globe as well too. Within our company, we have about 30 specialists focusing in on geohazards. We've got about 150 published papers, over 7 decades of experience in our group. And between probably the 3 of us that are shown on the screen here, we've modeled about 2 million landslides in the last 2 years. So I've got about 10 minutes for this presentation, and I'm going to blast through about 3 years of our work in 10 minutes. So it's going to be hot and heavy here, and I'm just going to kick it off. So what I'll be talking about today is debris flows and how our research has been able to produce some of the first climate change adapted debris flow hazard models. So not all of us are geohazard experts on this call, obviously. So what is a debris flow? A debris flow is a rapid moving landslide, generally highly saturated. And what's important about this, and what the USGS has done great in this little animation here, is that debris flows initiate obviously up in the higher hill slopes, but that runout can extend a far distance beyond the initiation source. And this becomes critical later on in the talk, understanding how the initiation links into our runout components of this. And also in this animation too, one of the key triggers of debris flows is rainfall. And so why do we care about debris flow hazards? And I was making this slide here, and I threw up some facts, some costs, but in reality, I was looking through some of my field photos that I was recently doing this summer, and this photo really sums it up. Like, why do we care about debris flow hazards? And part of that integrates back into risk. So if we look at risk as a nested set of conditions where we have a hazard and we have the consequence of that hazard, and the combination of those two equal our risk, the risk from debris flows really depends on what lens we're looking at, what we're looking through. So in this instance, you might be the power company looking at, why do debris flows matter to our power lines in this instance? Or we might be looking at this pipeline laydown station here, and they might be curious about how that will affect them. Or you might be with the Ministry of Transportation looking at how debris flows might affect transportation corridors to your communities. Or you could be with an NGO looking at salmon habitat in the Fraser River here, seen in the photo. So that's really what matters with this. And obviously in a changing climate too, the drivers of debris flows, i.e. rainfall in most instances and wildfire, are obviously being exacerbated through a changing climate. And so the way we look at debris flow hazard at Stantec, we break it into a 3-part probability. And so understanding these 3 components of debris flows and how they integrate into our assessments is critical. So first we look at the hazard in time and space, or rather what's the probability of debris flow initiation on the landscape through time. So we can see in this photo here, the landslide is obviously initiated up in the higher, steeper slopes, but it's run out onto this road. And so we can break the hazard in time and space to our initiation probabilities, but there's also a third component here, and that's the runout component. And what's the probability of it reaching a receptor that we're interested in? And so kind of flipping back to that last slide or thinking about this photo here, you know, what's our runout probability to the river, to this power line, or to the road? And so I'm going to start backwards in this equation and kind of break it down that way. So when we talk about runout or the probability of runout, Stantec uses debris flow predictor, which is an agent-based modeling software. For those of you not familiar with agent-based modeling softwares, they use an agent, or in this instance, it's a 5 meter by 5 meter pixel acting on a digital elevation grid with a set of rules behind it. And when we click go, it goes through a series of time steps and interacts with its environment to give us a result, a probabilistic result based off its interactions with its environment. And so it's a really simplistic approach to looking at a complex mathematical problem, but gives you a very simplistic approach to answering that complex problem. I'll scooch over here to the next one. And so this looks a little bit abstract. Obviously, what we've done here is we've modeled thousands of landslides on the landscape. Obviously, in reality, this doesn't occur, but what this does is, because our agent-based landslide model is probabilistic, it allows us to initiate landslides across the landscape and look at the receptor that we're interested in. So in this instance, we're looking at a linear asset that crosses a large colluvial fan across here. And then looking at the aggregate results of those probabilistic results, we're able to identify where areas along the linear asset where hazard might be a problem. And so we can think of this as kind of like a funnel, right? And so if I drop a handful of sand on top of this funnel, it's going to be hard to predict where the grains of sand might be in the top part. But as the convergent topography interacts and the debris flows are funneled through in our model space, we can start to identify these problem areas across the linear asset. And so that kind of couples our runout probability associated with debris flow hazard. And now we want to tie it back to our initiation source. And this is where we really made a big breakthrough in our group. And for the first time, I think we've really been able to quantify debris flow hazards with climate change. And the way we've done that is, going back to my original slide, is one of the primary drivers of debris flow hazard is rainfall. And so with some new satellite imagery that's become available on the market, Planet Fusion, which offers 365-day cloud-free imagery, which obviously on the West Coast isn't quite true. They do some interpolation methods. We've been able to leverage some of this new data to identify what rainfalls are associated with landslide initiation. And so what we've done is we've had our two study areas here near Vancouver and on Vancouver Island, excuse me. And we've gone through and we've used this satellite imagery to first identify landslides within a 5-year window. That's how far back our satellite imagery goes. And then we could tie that through that 5-year window, we can tie what day that landslide initiated on. And using the HRDPS weather model in Canada, we are able to tie a daily precipitation value to that landslide initiation. And thus we're able to tie the temporal component of that landslide initiation to the landslide, or to a rainfall exposure unit. So if I flip through again here, and what the result of that is a rainfall intensity curve that we've created here to a probability of landslide per area. So this is our landslide in time and in space, and the probability associated with rainfall intensity. And this becomes a really critical component to unlocking our ability to tie climate change to this. As Sue showed in her model, some of the RCP pathways, there is a lot of climate change modeling that's happening right now, and understanding the rainfall intensity changes through those various climate change models is well studied. And then linking that back to our primary driver of debris flows has enabled us to unlock profiles like this in our modeling. And what you're looking at here is the landslide hazard across a regional area based off the rainfall return event. So in the top left here, we're looking at historic conditions for the 1 in 50-year rainfall return period. And on the far right, we're looking at the 1 in 500-year rainfall return period. And if we wanted to go back and ask that question, what's debris flow hazard to the Fraser River, or what is it to the highway number 1? That's one of the main transportation corridors to Vancouver. Or what if we're the power line company here that's supplying power to the communities, right? Now we can start to understand what that hazard is through a changing rainfall intensity and understanding that. And moreover, now we're able to apply our different RCP pathways to that. And we can see here in RCP 3, which is one of the worst case scenarios that's being modeled right now, we can see the hazard drastically increases. And moreover, with that, these photos look quite abstract, right? I'm showing thousands of landslides on the landscape, but we want to filter that down and really answer rather our client questions and filter that down into the areas that really matter. So there's some stats that we can go through. I can give a full day course on this, but I'm not going to at this point. I'll just show you the Cole notes here. We can filter through our scenario probabilities and modeling to pick out the areas that really matter. And so you can see here, these are in areas where we've had 20 of our modeling scenarios interact. And those are the areas where we're going to focus our mitigation on. And what results in that is the landslide fingerprint that we've dubbed it. And we can see here the landslide fingerprint for this area on Cheam Mountain through the 200-year rainfall event, which is generally synonymous with the atmospheric river that hit Vancouver in 2021, causing multiple highway closures and affecting the economy substantially to one of the major port cities in Canada. But then we can also see how this climate change, or how this hazard is evolving through various climate change models. So here we can see RCP 2.6 and 8.5 in this, and we can actually quantify the difference in this. So linking it back, to a risk profiler through our risk lens, if we can understand and quantify our hazard in time through various climate change models, we can start to provide quantified risk profiles or monetize that for our clients as well too, and provide cost risk for that.
1 minute left, Graham.
Yeah, perfect. That's good timing. I'll leave you guys with some additional sources of information here if anyone's screenshotting this, but I'll leave it for the extra minute, Rachel, and we'll call it with that. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you so much, Graham. Okay, so we're all on the edge of our seats, ready to do the Q&A, but stay on the edge of your seat and stand up. Turn off your camera, turn off your microphone, put your questions in the chat, and we are going to come back in about 8 minutes. So that'll be 2:13, 13 after the hour, wherever you are. And we will do our Q&A with Sue and Graham. So take a break, and we'll be back in 8 minutes. All right. Welcome back, everyone. We are going to launch into our Q&A, but before we do that, I just want to give another virtual round of applause for both Sue and Graham. Really just such detailed presentations, and in particular, I am so excited by how well each of you was able to represent the principles from our living guide. And of course, we expect no less from 2 excellent ASAP organizational members, but thank you so much. That was super insightful. And we have a lot of questions that have come in. So let's get started with our first one here. Sorry about that. Okay, so Sue and Graham, wondering if and how you account for climate justice implications of the analyses that you're doing for your private or public clients. This questioner says they understand that your work is primarily looking to quantify the vulnerability and/or the impact of sea level rise, flooding, urban heat, debris flows, etc., under different scenarios through modeling. But has there been any thinking to incorporate the cumulative impacts on the more vulnerable or environmental justice populations? So Sue, do you want to go first?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, that's an excellent question. And so for us, these kinds of concerns come into play, especially during resilience planning with clients. So as we think about, our clients tend to be large employers in the areas where they have facilities, and thinking about, one of the measures that that a client could always take was just to move the facility, out of harm's way. And of course, that's something we want to try to avoid because that disrupts the lives and the community that the facility is part of. So sort of helping them think through actions that aren't going to have a negative impact on the community, but could potentially cause benefit to the community. That's something that we definitely focus on. So an example of when a client's resilience measures can assist a community and underserved populations within it are client facilities becoming, for example, a cooling center where people who can take refuge during times of extreme heat waves, or after a natural disaster. We've had clients use their facilities to stage FEMA service providers out of. So helping them think through those ways in which they are part of the community and can offer support to the community during times of sort of climate events, as well as making sure that their actions don't have unintended consequences on the community and its most vulnerable members.
Thanks, Sue. And what about you, Graham?
Yeah, that is a great question, and thanks for that answer too, Sue. That's really insightful. I'll think back to just something I was just mentioning here in conversation just before we started this. I just got back from the field supporting a post-wildfire assessment, and while we're under contract with the Ministry of Forest in British Columbia here, part of our assessment and part of our modeling and understanding the impacts of these hazards is also reaching out to First Nation communities in that area as well too, and understanding their traditional knowledges and their traditional values of that land as well too. So we take this into consideration. Like I sat with some of the council there while I was on my trip there, and we talked about some of the salmon spawning habitat that was valuable to them, and specific streams that they wanted me to search out, aside from my MOF or Ministry of Forest agenda as well too, right? So integrating that type of knowledge into our practice definitely occurs for sure, and something we always want to consider.
Thanks, Graham. So this next question was addressed to Sue, but I think both of you might have some insight on it. So Erin says she's curious about WSP's approach to recurrent analysis that might be a part of your portfolio, developing internal tools versus relying upon publicly available viewers and data. Is it a both and something else?
Yes, both and. It really depends on the area that we're looking at. In terms of, so the publicly available viewers, so like the CalAdapt viewers, for example, for sites in California are a tremendous resource, but those kinds of tools aren't available everywhere. So the data that we're able to bring to bear really depends on where we're looking. And so what we try to do is get the most granular data we can. That's what our clients need. And in terms of developing internal tools versus relying on those kinds of, so we try to make things as transparent as possible. Where we have internal tools, we're using those publicly available climate projections and using methods where we can explain very clearly to clients what we've done, because that transparency is really important for us, so that they're sure that we're standing well within the science, and transparent for them when they go to make disclosures and get audited, so that they can say they did this with this data. So what we try to avoid is the perception of a black box. We want the clients to know exactly what we did, exactly what data we used. And then we really, we'll often do sort of a general screening of an entire portfolio. And, sometimes we'll use a climate data analytics provider or our own internal tools for that. It's essentially the same thing. But then when we get to the resilience assessment part, that's when we draw in the more granular data. Like if there's, like for Manhattan or someplace like Boston where they have these kinds of viewers, we definitely use that so that we're leveraging the community locally developed data.
Yeah, and Graham, do you have any thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, I think Sue really capped it really well there. I mean, in British Columbia, at least, we're governed by an association, the Engineers and Geoscientists of British Columbia, which obviously dictate how we're able to lay out our assessments and the information that we need to provide. I.e., we're never black boxing anything. But yeah, I mean, it is something that we come up. Data availability is something that we're challenged with in practice, particularly as a consulting agency. sometimes we're working with remote communities where just the money hasn't been put into collecting LiDAR for that area, for example, or something like that, right? And it's something that, at Stantec we have grant writers and fund writers too that can support those communities to work with them to help support filling in those data gaps too, that might be able to facilitate assessments as well too. So
Yeah, and to that point, we did have a question come in about like, what do you do when you encounter a data gap, right?
yeah.
And is there anything else that you would share about, what you might do in real time as you encounter data gaps?
Yeah, I mean, I give you a very specific case study of how we're looking at debris flow hazard. But in some of those areas too, like our model, some of the models that we're developing in Stantec right now are, relying on some of that information that might not be available in these remote areas as well too, right? So there's always more than one way to do an assessment too, right? So understanding what's available to that client, what kind of questions that they're asking, and what we're consulted to answer helps form how we're going to approach that problem, right? It's the great thing about working with some of the people that I work with on my company. They're all great minds, and there's usually a way to figure it out. So
Great. So we've gotten in a couple of specific questions for each of you. So let me send you each one of those as we kind of get towards the end of our Q&A session. So Hannah Durrest asks, this is for Sue, does the OCOF analysis include the newer groundwater analysis such as Christina Hill, UC Berkeley work?
So the our CoStar Future tool relies on the Cosmos model, and I believe they do have a groundwater model that is part of that. But I don't specifically know if that person's modeling is part of that Cosmos modeling or not.
Thank you.
Great. And then here's one for you, Graham. In cases when snowpack is apparent, do your models take into account transition from snowpack to no snowpack and snow to rain regimes in impacting debris flow frequency and magnitude?
it's a great question. Something that we're trying to answer in our group as well too. I was with in a conference in Italy earlier this year, and there was a climatologist there, Ben Hatchett, I believe, from California, that gave a presentation directly on this. It's specifically related to debris flow frequency and magnitude. It is one of the a research data gap that is apparent in our practice, and Ben shone some good light on that during that presentation. One of his closing statements, though, that I'll bring back to this is, and it relates back to the ASAP principles here, is collaboration. Ben had, at the end of his presentation was like, you guys are all hazard folks that specialize in landslides. I specialize in climatology and understanding snowpacks and how their melt works. And he's like, there's always room for those collaboration between the two practices to understand these mechanisms better. And so much like my case study where, primarily rainfall is the driver for debris flow frequency or debris flow hazard in most instances, collaboration between these practices too can help flush out some of the answers for these and understanding the driving mechanisms, which again can, once we understand the driving mechanism, can be related back and forecasting out to future climate change scenarios.
And speaking of future climate change scenarios, there was a question that came in from Carlo. He notes that you both seem to use one climate model. And do each of you also use ensemble models in your work?
Yes, 100%.
Okay.
Ensembles is best practice. I showed a picture from one model, its output, just to give an idea of what the output looks like. But we typically use for a global portfolio, we'll use the NASA Next ensemble of downscaled climate projections, and we use the full complement of models.
Yeah, what Sue said too. I mean, unfortunately, we didn't have too much time to deep dive into it, but yeah, it was just kind of a snapshot of one of the models that we're using. But yeah, ensemble models for sure.
Yeah,
great.
The Australian Climate Service has this great web page on climate modeling do's and don'ts, and like number one of the don'ts is don't use just one model.
All right. So as we're wrapping up our Q&A here, I'd love to just turn it to each of you. This has been, each of your case studies was so rich and detailed, even though you only had 10 minutes. And then I loved the way that we were able to bring together so many of these concepts in the Q&A. As you're thinking about our conversation here, what's one thing that you would love to leave us with about good practice? Something that has inspired you in your work, or maybe even something that you're still working on, that you want to leave us as our final note here. And whoever's ready can go first.
Well, I was joking with you before this, Rachel, too. Like me and Rick were on the line just before this call, smashing heads trying to figure out, this is all new research coming out right now, and there's more room to evolve it through collaboration with different disciplines and different practices, and just realizing that this isn't a stagnant practice. This is something that evolves through time, and using the best information that we have now to facilitate our decision making is what we can do. But there's always room to improve on that and make it grow.
Great.
I think for me, the takeaway from a lot of this work is that there's no substitute for talking to people who are at a particular place and understanding their lived experience of climate change and climate hazards and working with them to develop solutions. I think for me, that's the most rewarding part of my job, is that kind of interaction. And that's exactly, the kind of interaction you need to have to make people feel invested and to move everyone forward. So.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to both of you for being here. We have recorded a lot of your questions and answers. Oh, go ahead, Sue. Okay. But if you want to respond to any other questions in the chat, yeah, thank you so much. All right, so we are going to move on to our second breakout activity. So let me share my screen here, and as I do, I am going to turn it over to Mia, who is going to walk us through the instructions.
Hello again, everyone. All right, don't be overwhelmed by the text on the screen. We are definitely going to break our next activity down for you. So next up, we have a set of activities where you're going to be using ASAP's Living Guide to analyze your own work. And with that, soon we'll be sending you roughly into those same breakout rooms that you were in earlier, aside from some new folks who have joined the session who are excited to put in your own breakout room. So with this, you can engage in the following 3 activities, however you like, with guidance from a room facilitator. You can do just one of these activities, 2, or all 3, and you'll have about 30 minutes to do this, okay? So the first activity is actually going to be an individual activity where you're going to be coming up with some questions to ask yourself to keep the principles close to your heart during your work. So you're going to be going through the Living Guide, looking at the principles, and connecting that back to your work and asking yourself some important questions. The next is a speed consulting activity where someone will share a challenge that they're having and getting wisdom from the rest of the group. And the last is a discussion focusing on where each person in your group has the power to make change, to put what you've learned today into action. So again, we just want to encourage you to take liberties and take the group wherever you want. And again, there will be a facilitator in your group to help you.
Hi, everyone. I think Mia is going to take us through some final reflections.
Hi, sorry, my audio cut out. Rachel, I'm assuming you introduced me and okay, great. Okay, perfect. So welcome back, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yep, awesome. So hopefully you've had a very productive and informative conversation in your breakout groups today. So we have a little bit of time. We'd love to hear maybe about 1 or 2 big picture insights or observations that you heard in your group. We'd love to have someone speak, but if you want to type it in the chat, that'd be fine as well. So does anybody have a big picture observation taken from their group today? Feel free to just unmute or you can raise your hand. Okay, looks like we have something in the chat. Yep, the Slack link is in the chat. Perfect. Thank you, Eliza. Okay, great. Well, we hope to hear your insights and reflections in the Slack, if none are coming to you right now. Perfect. So here are some more questions to get you thinking about reflections from today's session. Where do you have the power to make change? How will what you've learned influence your practice? And what questions still remain to you after or remain for you after this session? We encourage you all to use Slack to be in community and conversation with each other. Next slide. All right, wrapping up and looking forward, you just have a couple of announcements for you. First one is we strongly encourage you to extend your learning with our optional worksheets with the Academy curriculum. This is just something to look at after the session. If you want to keep thinking about climate data information as it relates to the Living Guide and the principles of climate adaptation. Something else, we strongly encourage you to sign up for a one-on-one consultation with our regional partners, depending on what region you're in. There are, presenters for that region that you can reach out to set up a one-on-one, or you can reach out to Rachel and I if you have any questions about the opening principal session or the closing session. And with that, we hope to see you next Tuesday at the Midwest session. That's at the same time, 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And you should have that link in the calendar invitation. And with that, we really want to thank you all for attending today, and I'll pass it off to Rachel.
Thanks so much, everyone. And I just want to give one final thanks to our presenters, to Sue and to Graham. We're so grateful that you could be here, and we will see you all hopefully on Tuesday for our Midwest regional session. Bye, everyone.